What led me to Paramahansa Yogananda was that I had read in high school 2 books on yoga philosophy, and I was impressed with what I read and with the practices that I tried to experiment with. And then when I was 18, I read his book, Autobiography of a Yogi, like many millions of people have now. And as soon as I read the book, I was convinced that this was my contact, and that he was my guru, or would be my guru. And so I resolved at that time, when I got out of high school, to go to California. So the autumn of 1949, I did just that. And I arrived there right around Christmas times, December 23rd, 1949. I was very fortunate to be able to meet him within an hour of my arrival. No one knew that I was coming. I hadn't sent a note ahead to let anyone know because I was hitchhiking across the country. But I arrived about 6 o'clock in the evening, and one of the senior monks invited me to have supper with the young fellows who were there in training. And after that meeting, after the supper time, Donald Walters, who was the senior monk at the time, invited me up to the main floor of the building of the SRF headquarters. And while we were talking, Paramahansa Yogananda and Faye Wright and her sister Virginia came through the room on the way out to the car. And Yogananda stopped for a moment and shook my hand. I would like to be able to say that he said, "I've been waiting for you," but he didn't. He shook my hand and he asked, "How old are you?" And I told him I was 18. His next question was, "Do your parents know you're here?" And I told him it was all right. And he said, "All right." And he still had an accent. He said, "All right. And I'll see you again," and went out to the car. So that was my first contact with him. The next day, I participated in a 6-hour meditation with the resident disciples and a few guests who had been invited. And then on Sunday morning, the 25th, I went to the Hollywood SRF temple to hear him lecture. And then that afternoon, I had a private talk with him. And I asked him then if I could be his disciple. And he said, yes, I could stay. And we only were together about 20 minutes, but it was sufficient. I remember on that occasion, after he gave me instruction on how to fit into the routine with the other fellows, and how often to meditate and what books to read. And his concluding words were, read a little, meditate more, and think of God all the time. So that was my immediate connection with him. My first impression was that I had known him before, or that it was a destined occasion, because there was simply quick rapport, instant rapport, and a feeling of security and trust in him. And so I didn't have to go through the process of getting acquainted with him to know him. There was an instant attunement with him, with his mind and his consciousness. And one of the most obvious characteristics, and many people have commented on this over the years who had met him, was his kindness. He was very attentive when he was interacting with people, very alert. He was a good listener, but he was very kind, non-judgmental. And everyone came away with the feeling of, well, he's a very nice man. Even if they didn't know he was a spiritual teacher, if he was dressed in ordinary clothes and didn't have his robe on, and he was not in the role of teacher, if they met him in a social situation, they almost invariably they came away impressed about how nice he was, how courteous and kind. Whenever I was with him, I felt a sense of omnipresence and great power, but not a personal, egocentric power, but a cosmic power that was just sort of embodied in his body, and he just carried that consciousness of wholeness and oneness. And when you were with him, you could feel that. He was very attentive to his disciples, and he, of course, communicated with each one according to their temperament and however best to communicate with them. He was very encouraging, very supportive, very encouraging. He always reminded us to pay attention to our daily routine of study and meditation, mostly meditation, and to do our work with an attitude of rendering service without attachment to the results. And so, of course, there in that environment, we were serving what he called his work or his mission at the Self-Realization Fellowship. So it was a privilege, really, to participate in that work that he represented. My personal experiences with him were very intimate and very, very helpful. I remember a few weeks after I had arrived, I saw him one evening in the lower hallway of the headquarters building, and we talked for just a moment or two, and he went into the elevator to go upstairs, and the door closed, and then the door opened again, and he put his head out, and I was still standing there. And he said, "You have a wonderful future, Roy." And that's how he worked with me. He always told me that I had a good future and that I should be patient and follow the procedures that he outlined for my spiritual practices. And then, of course, he did a marvelous thing for me. And this ties in with how he related to disciples. Within a few weeks after I arrived, he sent me over to Phoenix, Arizona. There was one minister over there, a young man, 2 years my senior, who was needed some assistance there with the work that he was doing. And Master sent me over there and told me to come back to see him every 2 months. And that was a marvelous thing that he did, because my temperament is I tend to be introverted, and I have never needed the support of a group around me for encouragement or feeling of security. So over there, I was all alone except for this one brother disciple who was a good role model, and for the most part very quiet, and we only talked once a week to instruct me on what needed to be done. And then every two months I would go back to California, and that gave me an opportunity to be with Yogananda privately for 2 or 3 hours each time I visited him. And sometimes an hour one day, an hour another day, 30 minutes this day, 2 hours the next day. And usually we just sat and talked, and I let him do the talking. I learned that was the most useful thing to do. And now and then we would walk around the perimeter of his retreat facility out at 29 Palms, California. And I never went over with any pressing questions or any needs. I always made sure that when I went, I had been in a positive mood and been meditating, because I wanted him to see that I was doing well with my spiritual practices. But on one occasion, we were walking around the property, and he talked for a while about God and the spiritual path, and told me some stories about his experiences with his guru, Sri Yukteswar. And then after a while, there was a quiet pause, and then he asked, "Do you have any questions?" And one came into my mind. I had, a few weeks earlier, been perusing his book, Autobiography of a Yogi. And of course, in that book, he had written about many saints that he met when he was a young boy in India, back in the early part of the 1900s. And the thought had come to my mind, I wonder how many of these saintly people by now are spiritually liberated, meaning fully enlightened and without any delusions or illusions, fully self-realized. So I asked that question. And his answer was very, very direct and nonchalant. He said, "Oh, not many." He said, "Many saints are satisfied to experience the bliss of God communion, and they don't aspire to go beyond that stage." Then after a pause, he said, "But you must go all the way," and that's how he encouraged me. He was always reminding me of what he called the goal, the aim of life, which is to be fully spiritually awake. And he always said, "You can do it." But that was his emphasis with me. When I was with him, we never talked about comparative religions or theology. It was always about the importance of being focused on the spiritual path with the aim of being spiritually enlightened. One of Master's most spiritually advanced disciples was a businessman who lived in Kansas City, Missouri, Mr. James Lynn. He had been born in Louisiana. His father was a sharecropper. He left home in his middle teens, went to Kansas City, finished his education there, his high school education, and then studied accounting and went to law school. And by the time he was 21, he was admitted to the bar as a lawyer, and also he was a certified public accountant. And he then had a job with an insurance company, a small insurance company that specialized in selling policies to wholesale lumber dealers. And then after a very few years, the owner had to retire for reasons of health, and a business associate of Mr. Lynn's, who was a vice president of a bank in Kansas City, loaned him the money to buy the business. And he paid the business off in 3 years from the profits that were generated. And so by age 30, he had already made his first million. But as he said later to some disciples with whom he talked, he said, "I was successful in a material way, but I was not satisfied. I was very restless, and something was missing in my life." And so in 1931, Paramahansa Yogananda lectured in Kansas City, and Mr. Lynn was invited by his wife to go to hear Yogananda at the public lectures. And the first night, he said, he sat in the back of the auditorium, and suddenly he realized for the first time in a long time he wasn't restless. He was very calm. And then shortly after that, he met Master personally. And for the remainder of the time that Master was in Kansas City, every morning on the way to work, Mr. Lane would leave early from home, drop by Master's hotel, and spend time with him in his hotel room. And there he learned the basic practices of Kriya Yoga. He learned to meditate. He was initiated into meditation practices. And the first time he practiced Kriya Pranayama in Yogananda's presence, when he was initiated, he experienced a state of ecstasy. And then he kept on with his practices, maintained his business interests. In fact, his businesses expanded. He founded another insurance company for wholesale auto dealers. Finally, later on, branched out into oil drilling in Louisiana and Texas. But he always maintained his daily meditation practice, and he became very, very accomplished as a meditator. And within 6 years, Yogananda told me that he was able to experience transcendent samadhi or superconsciousness. And then, of course, he was very generous through the years with financial support for the organization. And shortly before he passed in 1955, 3 years after Yogananda passed. Shortly before he passed, he transferred $1 million to SRF and stock that he owned. And then, when he passed in 1955, he left another $3 million to the organization. So he was very supportive of the work, naturally, but he was a highly skilled meditator. And Master told me one time, he said, he called him Saint Lin. He said, "Saint Lin, is the perfect example of Western practicality and Eastern spirituality. So he was, and I knew Mr. Lin, and not socially, but I had a chance to meditate with him a few times and to receive his blessing. So he was a very saintly person. I remember there were two Indian gentlemen who visited the Master in 1951 at the Self-Realization Fellowship headquarters, and they met Mr. Lin, and they interacted and talked together and meditated together. And then when Mr. Lin was getting ready to depart and go down to Southern California, he was down by his car, getting ready to get in his car and drive to his destination. And the two Indian gentlemen were there, and they said goodbye to him, and they both knelt down and touched his feet, which in India is a traditional way to show respect to a holy man or to someone you respect. And then he turned to one of the male disciples. One of the Indian men turned to one of the male disciples and said, even in India, I have not seen one like him. So he was a very, very exceptional person. Master always said that his work was done in quantity and quality. In the early 20s and 30s, when he came to this country, at first in 1920, but then in the 20s and 30s, he lectured before large audiences, and he called that his quantity work, reaching as many people as possible with a helpful message and information about how they could improve their lives and nurture their spiritual growth. But he was also always on the lookout for those special people who were very receptive to what he had to offer, and he called that the quality work. And of course, the numbers of quality disciples or students were few compared to the many that were served in this wider way. But he liked to reach out to everyone, but he was always looking for those few special people, like Mr. Lin and Fay Wright and a few others, who really connected with him and stayed with him for years and derived great benefit from their relationship with him. Their personal relationship between Master and St. Lin was, of course, very respectful. Master told me that whenever Mr. Lin visited California for his private retreats, he said, "We only talk about God. We don't talk about business." He knew that Mr. Lin had his business activities and responsibilities, and when Mr. Lin was in California, he wanted him to be able to withdraw from that temporarily and devote himself entirely to his inner life. So they had a very intimate spiritual relationship and a very confidential relationship. Yogananda had a good sense of humor. It was quiet humor. I never saw him frivolous, but he would sometimes tell humorous stories and laugh along with us, little anecdotes. But if we were with him informally, just as several of us would meet him occasionally in the lower hallway of the main building when he was on his way to his car or coming back from a trip, he would stop and talk with us, and he would tell us sometimes little humorous stories, but he never left us in a light, frivolous mood. He always ended our time together with a provocative thought or a positive idea for us to contemplate, to think about. And we always knew when it was time to conclude the get-together and let him go his way and for us to get back to work, because he would pause and then he would say, "All right." That meant goodbye. One evening I was walking out on the grounds at SRF headquarters. It was dark, and I looked up the winding driveway to the headquarters building, and I saw someone walking in my direction in the dim light, and I didn't know who it was. So I just stood there at the foot of the driveway And I waited, and as the person approached, I recognized it was Master. He was out for an evening walk. And he asked, who's that? Identified myself, and he stopped. And just then another disciple, male disciple, came along and stopped. And Master talked with us just 2 or 3 minutes. And then we thought he was going to say, all right, and move on. But he took off his hat and gave it to me, and he handed his cane, his walking stick, to the other fellow. And then he just went like this 2 or 3 times, tense and relaxed. And that was one of his energization exercise routines. Just did it 2 or 3 times like that. Took his hat and his walking stick back, and he said, see, no matter how busy I am, I always do my exercises. Then he said, all right, good night, boys. Faye and Virginia Wright met him also in the early 30s. Faye was 17 at the time, just finishing high school. And she had thought of joining a convent, although she was raised as a Mormon. And her mother and brother went to hear Yogananda's public lectures in Salt Lake City, invited her to come and with them. And when she saw him on the stage, she was instantly attracted to him. And she had some facial condition of, I don't know what the cause was, more than acne, but she had some sores on her face, and which made her more shy than she ordinarily would have been. And one night at one of these public lectures with hundreds of people in the auditorium, Master invited her up on the stage, and he asked her about her condition of her face and how long she had that condition had bothered her. And she said she had been quite some time. She had been the dermatologist. They hadn't been able to find a solution. And then he asked her, he said, do you believe you can be healed? She said, yes, I do. And he held her hand. And he said, by the power of God in me, I say that in 7 days you will be healed. And 7 days later, her face was clear, and the condition never returned. Shortly after that, she asked for permission to move to Los Angeles headquarters, and be a resident disciple. And Master said, I've been waiting for you to ask. So she and her sister moved there, and later her mother and her brother moved there. And Faye and her sister Virginia became Yogananda's confidential secretaries. Were with him for years. They typed his letters, they answered the telephone, they arranged his appointments, they passed word from him to others in the organization about what he wanted to have done. And they were just a team, his right hand workers. And so it was, after many, many years, shortly before Master passed. He passed in 1952 in March. But shortly before he passed, he was talking with Dayamata and about the future of the work, as he called it. And he said, you are the one I have chosen to guide this ship into the future. And she said, no, I don't want the responsibility. And he said, I've had it all of these years, now it's your turn. So Mr. Lin was Master's choice to succeed him as president of the organization, which he did in 1952 when Master passed. But then when Mr. Lin passed in 1955, then Faye became the president. And she remained the president from 1955 until the year 2000, when she passed at the age of 96. And over the years, I maintained close contact with her because I had first met her the night I met Master in 1949. And after he passed, she was the one I interacted with because I was appointed to be the minister of the church, SRF Center in Phoenix after Master passed. And in fact, Master passed on March 7th, and they had the memorial service or the funeral service at SRF headquarters in the middle of the following week. And the very next day, Faye invited me into her office and gave me my minister's certificate. Master had ordained me 5 months earlier, but she said then, she said, it's Master's wish that you be the minister at the Phoenix Center. So that's how I became the minister there. And I was there for the next 2 years all by myself. Again, it was a beautiful experience because I liked seclusion. I had full time to devote to my spiritual practices. I only had a Sunday morning and a Thursday evening service to conduct, occasional phone calls. I had to mow the grass and maintain the building, of course, but I had my own private monastery there for 2 years, and I went over to Los Angeles for special events like summer convocations and Christmas meditation and so on. But the rest of the time, for those 2 years, in 1952 and 53, I was alone as the minister of the Phoenix Center. And that was Master's plan for me. I remember I visited him at his desert retreat facility on one occasion, and he said to me, "Be patient, Roy, I have plans for you." He never told me what the plans were, but he had plans and let me know through Faye what the plans were. Faye and Virginia were always with him when he was, except when he was by himself, but they were the ones who, I mentioned earlier, typed his letters and manuscripts, and just gave him full support. They were always there to help him accomplish what he wanted to accomplish. And then there was another person who came along years later, who became part of that team, and that was Myrna Brown, who came into the work when she was in her 9th grade in high school, and later became, well, after Dayamata passed, by that time she had the name Dayamata, the monastic name, given to her by one of the Shankacharyas in India many years before. But when she passed in 2000, then Myrna became the president and is now the president at this time, and her monastic name is Myrnalini. But those three were with him all the time when I was there. He was very gracious with guests who came. He frequently invited people to come to see him, and sometimes special people that he would invite and he would prepare or have prepared under his supervision, a meal usually with Indian flavored foods, and very, very attentive to their needs. And sometimes, if the guests were really interested in him and the teaching, he would keep them for hours, way into the night, way after midnight. And Dayamata told me a story about his thoughtfulness. There was a Swami in Los Angeles area who was also from the same part of India that Master had come from, Bengal, up just north of Calcutta. And they used to get together from time to time. Master would go to his ashram and they would have a meal together, and then Master would invite him up to SRF headquarters and have a meal together and sit around and talk, and they enjoyed each other's company. And Dayamata told me, she said, whenever that Swami was scheduled to come and have supper with Master, he always reminded us to have a separate saucer by his plate, by the Swami's plate, so he could have his after-dinner cigarette. So that was back in the days. You didn't put up a sign saying no smoking. No one smoked when I was there. We didn't have any smoking or drinking or cussing or carrying on. But if Master knew someone that he invited had a habit of that kind, back in those days, he would provide for that. And so there was no sense of being judgmental about it. So he was always very gracious. He counted the disciples' birthdays from the time that they met him. And I remember I met him at Christmas time, 1949. So right after that was January, and January 5th was his birthday. And we always met with him in the chapel of the headquarters building for a while, and then after we had a meal with him. And so a year later, in 1951, we were in the chapel and I meditated with him, and he was just talking informally. And he looked over and saw me off to one side with where the fellows, where the male monastics were sitting. And he said, "Oh, Roy is 1 year old now." So I'm only 67 years old now. Herbert Freed, who was the minister who preceded me at the Phoenix SRF Center, told me in a story that he had been visiting Master. It was his time to be in California for a few days, and at that time it must have been in the summer, late summer of 1950, because Master was at that time supervising the planting of trees and bushes and shrubs on the Lake Shrine property out there and near Santa Monica. And he asked Herbert to go with him. So usually someone else drove the car. Master didn't drive. He sat in the back seat of his car, and he had Herbert go with him so they could talk. And they went to a nursery to buy some plants for the Lake Shrine. And they went, and Herbert told me that the owner was from a Lebanese gentleman. And so he and Master talked about various things and became acquainted. Then they walked around, and Master picked out some shrubs and some small bushes and some little trees and so on. And he asked for the price, and whenever he got the price, he would say, "Oh, you have to come down a little bit on that one, or you have to throw in this, and this too." And they went back and forth like this in a friendly fashion. And after they finished, the Lebanese gentleman shook his hand and said, "Mr. Yogananda, I've enjoyed this very much. Please come back whenever you want to." And Herbert told me later, he said, "I grew up in the streets of Los Angeles, and I've seen wheeling and dealing, but Master embarrassed me." He had never seen this kind of carrying on before. But another time I remember Master came in from late at night after Christmas. Someone had given him some personal money to spend, and usually he didn't really want anyone to give him things for Christmas, not even money. He usually said, "If you're going to give money, give it to the organization." Well, someone gave him a little bit of money, so he went down to with Faye in Virginia, and Virginia always drove the car for him, and they went down to Hollywood, and he found a set of canes, Czechoslovakian canes that were carved, a matched set of canes. And just for some reason, at that time, he was using a cane now and then. He had some difficulty with his knees. And he showed, and I was there when his car came in by the side of the building, and another fellow was there, another disciple. And Master was in a very happy mood, and he showed us his canes, his treasure. And he said, "I got them at a very good price," and he was very, very happy with his purchase. And I could see Faye and Virginia in the front seat just smiling because they had witnessed this transaction. And then, after a few minutes, Master said to Faye, "Don't we have an extra carpet in the storeroom that might fit his living room?" And she said, "I think we do." He said, "Have the boys take it down as a gift tomorrow." So that was a part of his personality. He enjoyed having fun and making these purchases, but he also made sure the other person came out well in one way or another. And in the 20s, in the 50s rather, when they decorated the new buildings that they had constructed, much of the furniture that looked very nice had been purchased in used furniture stores and refinished by some of the monastics, so it was brand new and sparkling and in good shape. But of course, you buy it in a used store, you get it very cheaply. You don't have to spend much money, but you can fix it up yourself and make it look quite nice. Yes, he loved to have the grounds beautiful all the time. Flower gardens, and the grass had to be mowed, and the sidewalks had to be swept, and the entrance roads had to be swept clean. And even today, people who visit the SRF headquarters and also the Lake Shrine and also Encinitas Retreat, 25 miles north of San Diego, they are very much impressed with the landscaping. Everything is just beautiful. One time I was with him with a few of the other fellows, and just having conversation, talk back and forth. And one of the fellows asked, "Sir, what did Sri Yukteswar, your guru, what did he do for you?" And Master said, "He made me what I am." He said, when I went to him, he said it was very difficult at first, for the first several months, because he said he was very strict. And of course, if people who've read Autobiography of a Yogi or know that Master, when he was very young, was very impulsive and extremely devotional. And Yukteswar was just the opposite. He was very strict and rational. He had a devotional nature, but it wasn't emotional devotion. It was reverence and respect for the spiritual path and for saints, but he was very strict. But Master told us, he said, I told my guru, I said, you will never get rid of me, no matter how many times you discipline me. He said, you will never get rid of me. And then he said to us, he said, I needed that training to balance my personality, to prepare me to come to America. So he paid respect. He paid respect to his guru and said, he did exactly what needed to be done in my case to get me prepared for this work. Master sometimes said, in regard to his plans for the growth of the work of the organization for the purpose of serving people, he sometimes said, I chew off more than I can chew, and then I chew it. So sometimes at board meetings, when he would tell the members of the board of the organization that he had the plans of building a new building or some project that was going to cost a considerable amount of money, whoever was in charge of the bookkeeping would say, sir, we don't have the funds. We can't go forward with that right now. And he would say, God told me to do it. And he didn't mean that God had whispered in his ear, but he meant he was inspired to do this because it would be useful for people to have it done. And then he would say, we can start. We don't need the money to start. We can begin. And then the money always came in. Sometimes it was slow coming in, but it always came in, and his projects were always completed. But he didn't hesitate just because the funds weren't immediately available. I don't know how many people that Yogananda authorized to initiate over the years, probably several dozen over the years. I remember when he authorized me to initiate, I was visiting him in Los Angeles with Herbert Freed, the minister from Phoenix, was with me. And we'd been there 3 or 4 days, must have been around Thanksgiving time. And in late November, and this was in 1951, and we were down at the side entrance of the building when his car came in, and he got out and he saw Herbert and I standing there, and he said, come with me, boys. And we went down the hallway to the elevator, went upstairs with him, and in the hallway upstairs, he sat in the chair, and Herbert stood in front of him and I stood at his left. And first he talked to Herbert about the Phoenix Center and asked to be remembered to some of the members that he had met, whom he had met a couple of years before, 3 years before, when he dedicated the center. And then he turned to me, and it seemed almost like an afterthought. He said, "Oh, kneel down," just like that. And so I knelt by his chair, and he put his hands on my head, and he said, "I ordain you a minister of self-realization. Heal as I have healed, teach as I have taught, and initiate devotees of God into Kriya Yoga." And Herbert was observing this, and he knew as well as I did that at that time there were only 2 or 3 ministers who were authorized to initiate people other than Yogananda. And so Herbert asked Master, he said, "Sir, is Roy to initiate people?" And Master said, "You too. The same God who is in me is in you, and what I have done you should do." So that's how he was with working with disciples. When they were ready to represent him and the tradition, he would say, "Do it." So I don't know how many that he authorized over the years. There must have been many. And many dropped away, and then many passed on, of course. But the authorization or permission to initiate from the Guru is important in the yoga tradition because it means that that person who is authorized to initiate and to represent the tradition is a link in the lineage of gurus, so that when the embodied guru departs the physical plane, disciples are out there representing the tradition, and so they become gurus or teachers, teacher representatives. I didn't initiate anyone after I was given permission to do so for 3 or 4 years, because I had to be more mature and more knowledgeable. Yeah, but eventually I began. So probably in the past 60 years, I've initiated probably 20,000 people worldwide. Many of them have passed on because they were older than I was when I knew them. And of course, a certain percentage have drifted away. But quite a few have stayed regular with their practices. And in the yoga tradition, it's understood that the transmission of the teaching goes from teacher to student, and from that, or qualified students to their students, and from those qualified students to their students. And it's other than it's not a formal organization matter. It's although they may work within an organization, but it's the spiritual transmission from one to another through the generations. And so I've been doing this for many years, and from time to time I have thought how interesting it is that I grew up on a farm in Ohio. I read Yogananda's book when I was 18, had the privilege of knowing him and having his support and encouragement and spiritual help. And now here I am representing the Guru, this tradition. It must be God's grace or destiny, because when I shouted out, I didn't plan this. I was always open to the possibility, willing to serve and to share, but I didn't. When I first went to Master, I didn't go with the idea that in a few years I'm going to be a teacher. That just wasn't part of the process. With him and also with other gurus who are competent, a student goes, he becomes a disciple or a learner, and when they're ready, then the teacher says, "Now you can share this with others." And some do, some have that capacity or that ability, and others don't. So you can't just go be a teacher of this tradition in 4 or 5 years of study. It just doesn't work. There has to be a deeper spiritual connection there. Whenever I visited Master in California during my visits in 1950 and 51, he invariably would tell me just before I got ready to leave and go back to Phoenix, he would invariably say, "Now you stay in tune with me, because when you're in tune with me, I can help you. And when you're not in tune, it's like having static in the mental radio." And people ask me, what does he mean by attunement? Well, it's like with anyone you respect and love, you think of them with good feelings, and you have a feeling of warmth and closeness, even when you're not with them physically. So you have a spiritual and mental connection. Even though you're not physically together, you are still one in mind and spirit. And I was able to experience it when I was over in Phoenix, 300 miles away from him, physically, that I could just think of him, and it was just like he was there with me. And I still have that awareness today. So, and he assured me that was the way our relationship was, because I remember on one occasion, the first year I was with him, I was walking around the property at his retreat house in 29 Palms, and the one question I asked on my own, I asked if I had been with him before. Every new disciple wants to know if they've been with the Guru before. And I remember he said, "Of course you have, many times. How could you be with me now if you weren't with me before?" And then he said, "You almost died last year. The previous year I had rheumatic fever and was very ill for 5 months." He said, "You almost died last year, but your love for God pulled you through." And it was during that time that I read his book and resolved to go to California to meet him when I got well. And he said, almost like he was caught by surprise, and the insight had just come into his mind, and he said, "You died young last time too, but he said you have a new life now, and you must make the most of it." So he was always with me. He always provided that feeling of confidentiality and warmth and closeness and reassurance. So that's just how he was. Of course, Yogananda was a visionary in that he was always open to having guidance, really, or of how to spread the work more effectively, reach more people in a positive way. He had a lot of willpower, of course, but he also was open to guidance, and he wanted to do the right thing all the time. But he just didn't sit around daydreaming. He always had pictures in his mind of possibilities, and I heard him say on more than one occasion that I sow my desires in the ethers, and they must come into manifestation. That was his idea. He put them in the ether, and they would have to materialize. I talked with him in 1951 privately one evening in his room at Self-Realization Fellowship headquarters, and he told me then about the dedication of the lake shrine, and he said right above it there was property that didn't come with the property that was given to us. And I asked Mr. Lin to buy it. He said that was the first time I ever asked him to spend money for the organization. But Mr. Lin did buy it. And he said even then, Master said, back in 1951, 51, he said, "One day there will be a beautiful temple here." Well, in the 1990s, a beautiful temple was built on that site on the hill above the lake. But Master had that in his mind in 1950, and it didn't come into manifestation until 40 years later. but he picked Dayamata as the right choice to be the president of the organization, as he said, to guide the ship into the future, because he had talked to her and her sister and a few others about his plans for the future. Dayamata, after Master passed, Dayamata sent me a letter one time with a carbon copy of some of the meetings of the last meeting of the board of directors with Yogananda when he was still embodied, and he had given them his plans for the spread of the work into the future. And over the years, much of what he wanted done has been done, and that's largely because of Faye Wright, later Dayamata, because she knew what Master's wishes were, and she saw to it that they were fulfilled. One of the things he said at that time, he said, build in California first, and then go out from there. Train teachers to go out into the world. But he said, keep Autobiography of a Yogi highly visible in bookstores, and advertise it in mass circulation magazines at least 4 times a year. And they have done this consistently. And now that book, Autobiography of a Yogi, has been published in 35 languages, and 15 other languages are being prepared for publication. And I don't know how many millions of copies have sold. 2 or 3 years ago, they were selling 50,000 copies a year in the United States, year after year after year. And that's the kind of vision he had. He was very practical, because he said that book is the best contact we have with the public. People who read the book either respond to it or they don't. But many people read it and they say, wow. And it gets them started. I've talked to many religious science and unity ministers and independent meditation teachers, and they've said, I got my start reading Autobiography of a Yogi. So he was very practical, and he knew what would work. But Dayamata was the one who made sure that all of these plans were fulfilled. Well, what impressed me most about Master was his being. He was always, to me, he was always self-realized, God-conscious, established in that. And as we talked, he could, he enjoyed the things like landscaping and interacting with people socially in a quiet way. But there was always this awareness that he was grounded in something that was very big. He was just an embodiment of that, and you couldn't be with him very long without becoming aware of the fact that you were in the presence of someone who was very spiritually conscious and strong, and really very strong. It's not quite the same, naturally, without Master there, because his personal presence pervaded everything. And when he was on the grounds and the property, there was a different feeling in the air. Oh, Master's here! You could feel it, like his aura was spread out there, And so it's one thing to have the memory of the Master, but to have the Master's physical presence is something else. Well, he's the product, as he said, of his number one, of his destiny, also his past, because as a boy, his parents were disciples of Larry Mahashaya, a great yogi in Benares, who was a disciple of Mahavatar Babaji in the Himalayas. So Master's parents were disciples of Larry Mahashaya, and they practiced meditation. And his father instructed him in meditation practice, and then later his Sanskrit tutor gave him more advanced instruction. So as a young boy, from the age of 12 and 13, he was meditating long hours in the seclusion of the attic room in the family house in Calcutta. And then as he grew up, he met other saintly people and visited temples and places of pilgrimage, and then he met his guru and had 10 years of training with him. So it's just that he said one time when one of the fellows said, "Sir," when he gave someone some advice, and the person said, "Sir, it's easier for you to say that because you're the master." And the master said, "How do you think I got to be what I am? I did it because I did the work." In other words, he did what had to be done to become the person that he was. Yogananda made a strong impression on the world because, number one, he was very intentional. He knew exactly what his mission was, and he was determined to make it known, and always with the idea of serving people. But as I mentioned earlier, he had a lot of willpower, but also a lot of faith, and also the willingness to get into action and do what had to be done to accomplish his purposes. He wasn't lazy by any means. In fact, in his later years, he spent a lot of time with people who visited him. He really took his time, but and I wish at times he would spend more time by himself in his later years, seeing to his health and his energy. But he was always putting himself out for people. Long hours, always doing something for other people. And then, of course, toward the end of his earth life, as Dayamata and Virginia have shared, that he worked very long hours finishing his writing projects, commentary on the Bhagavad Gita and other books that he wanted to finish. And he would tell them, "We must do this now. There isn't much time." And he was conscious of the fact that he wouldn't be around for a long time, and he had a lot of projects to finish before he left. And in fact, the Bhagavad Gita that he wrote an extensive commentary on the text was not published until many years after he passed. And although he had written commentaries for many years, from the 1920s onward, that were published in their magazine in serialized form. But then at the desert retreat in 1551, he went through the Gita completely and reorganized what he had written and added to it. And so it came out to 1,500 pages. And I remember at his birthday gathering in 1952, just a month and a few days before he passed, he said of the Gita, he said, "A new scripture has been born, and you will see it when it is published next year." That was the way he thought. I've done it, it's done, and let's get it published next year. Well, there was nobody who could edit 1,500 pages adequately in a year's time, especially a book of that nature. And so it took several years for it to be finished, but finally came out in the 1990s, which I thought was a little extremely late. But anyway, finally got out. But he finished it before he passed. One of the remarkable things about his life and work is that it has continued to grow and to be influential around the world. There are more people today aware of what he taught and have access to his teachings than ever before. It keeps on growing and growing and growing. Of course, in our current era, there are increasing numbers of people who are becoming more receptive to these teachings. And then, of course, the fact that he trained Dayamata and others and told them how to present the work into the future. But someone asked him one time, "Why does the autobiography of a yogi change so many lives?" And he said, "Because my spirit is in it." And I think that's the key there. That for those who are receptive to what to his way of presenting the yoga philosophy, you have to be receptive to really get it. But to those who are receptive, they also get his spirit, and that's the transformative influence. Many people don't understand that. They can't even explain it. They say, I just feel different when I read Yogananda's writings or when I think of him or I see his picture. But they don't know that they are picking up on the spirit of his consciousness. And that's transformative. And that will continue. But it also continues to be transmitted through some of his disciples and their disciples and so forth.